The men were still out catching their breath. They were trying to get their emotional state ready to continue on this journey they had agreed to not so long ago. But recently, the fervent pace, the seemingly endless antagonism toward these people had begun to bubble over and pour out onto their tired and stretched thin bodies and worn out minds. It was just a few days ago that news had arrived to this group that one of their friends was executed for just talking about them. Their mission, his mission really, would they be next? What would happen if they were found? Maybe this guy they've been following is a little bit more than he says he is, or even worse, maybe he's not what he says he is at all, but something nefarious, antagonistic. Maybe he throws people away, and they should be looking for a new leader. They'd been trying to grieve their friend's death. Some of them went off alone to grieve privately around the corner. Others sat in groups and distracted themselves with whatever meaningless idle chit-chat came to their mind. But there was never a moment's peace when you're in this group. Almost as soon as they had finally taken time to sit, just a little bit of time for themselves, the crowd began to swell. Coming in from every corner of local towns, every dirt road, every path, full like anthills, all returning back to the colony with little gifts and goods for the queen. They piled in, they swarmed around, they were expectant, they were desperate. Compassion. Compassion's what he liked to call it. Like a mother holding their baby close to their body to shield them from what the world has to throw at them. Cold air, hunger for the first time, loud noises. But like a mother brings an infant back towards their chest to shelter them with the warmth of their body, the steady rhythmic breathing and their steady beat of their heart. This was compassion. He could not, or he would not, say no to what they needed. And despite the exhaustion and the grief, he healed them. He was starting to look a little more ragged than he ever had. Every healing, every teaching, every miracle seemed to take a little bit more of whatever he had left in him. His hair was full of grime and dirt from long desert travels, the stains of the water drying still all in his travel cloak, and his eyes were puffy and bagged out and as red as they had ever been, in need of more rest than what would be offered. Blisters popped and oozed and bled on his feet where the thongs of his sandals rubbed as they walked miles and miles a day. See, they had figured something else was going on, like they were being led somewhere, but he remained silent about that. But the real question is, who are these guys to even be with him on this journey? If you opened up the LGHS yearbook, that's the Lake Galilee High School yearbook for anyone who's unfamiliar. Most of them don't even have pictures outside of the alphabetized portrait that's in their grade levels. They weren't valedictorians, they didn't lead any plays, there were no solos or artwork to put on display. Just a couple of guys, boys really, whose great aspiration in life was to become an apprentice fisherman in the family business. Or worse yet, one of them was a former tax collector. And this other guy, he always had this little sikka, a dagger on his hip. They called him Iscariot, sketchy. Needless to say, they weren't exactly the who's who, the 20 under 20 of Galilee. They were basically flunkies. Sure, they had made it through Beth's affair, right? They each tried their best. The brothers all swore the other one cheated to make it through. But they knew the law well enough. They had it mostly there for recall. Talmud was another story. Most of them decided, or really it was decided for them, that continuing on in religious education or furthering it in any way was not a path of success for you. So back home a lot of them went. They learned the family job as an apprentice, fisherman. Others of their friends went on. into Beta Midrash, more teachers to listen to, more scribes to read from, more scribes to learn from, more scrolls to read, top flight students. Some of their friends even got paired with a mentor, a rabbi that would tell them, hey, you need to come and learn and continue to learn from me. Leave everything there, just follow me from now on and be like me in every way that you can. But these guys, they were the rabble, the leftovers, the others, the dropouts. Who were they? Nobodies. Why did they even follow this guy? Why did they even get to? The crowd had been around for a while now, and it was getting a little bit later, and the people who gathered were getting hungrier. They decided that the best path forward was to just send these people away, back to those outskirted villages that they came from, to scrounge up whatever food they could get for themselves. They came. It was their decision. They came without food. They had stayed for too long. It's not our problem to take care of them. Compassion. Is this what they were supposed to learn from him today? They gathered up a couple scraps of food that they had and somehow passed it around, and everybody ate with food left over. Enough even for them to pack up extra and load it onto the boat to continue their journey to wherever it was they were headed. Maybe on that boat they would finally get a little bit of rest, some time to grieve, sit quietly and process. He told them to go ahead and go across the lake by themselves. He wanted a little more time alone. Who could blame him? He'd finally gotten the crowd to disband and go home. He looked even more tired than he did earlier that day. His breaths were deep and more raspy, the bags under his eyes even darker and puffier. Rest, finally. But that wasn't on the cards. A storm sprang up out of nowhere, as Galilee was rather known for its sudden squalls that seemed to spring to life randomly on a lake. But this storm seemed to be alive, angry, vengeful. The waves became invaders to their boat, passing over the edge and filling the hull in a desperate attempt to make this vessel no longer seaworthy. As if the waters had sprung to life with the sole intent of drowning these boys in the boat. Even the wind was against them. No matter how hard they rowed, they were pushed and bashed in whatever direction the wind demanded. And with every bucket that they bailed out of the side, the wind whipped the water back into the boat. These boys, these dropouts, former fishermen, were terrified. What were we doing here? Have you ever gotten somewhere and thought to yourself, how did I get here? Anyone? Great. I don't belong here. When I was an undergrad, I don't think I've told you this story, so I have a backup story in case this is a rehash. So if anyone, just go, it's a rehash. About me in Spanish in college, rehash? Great. This is better. I'll tell you the other one too. I changed degrees my junior year in college. And I went from having passed all of the needed Spanish by taking a pre-test when I got there as a freshman to suddenly needing 2 more semesters of Spanish. The last time I took Spanish, I was a senior in high school. This is now 3 years later. And I say, that's fine, I can take Spanish 300. So I sign up for Spanish 300 in the fall, or in the spring. I go to class, I sit down, and every person in the room is speaking fluent Spanish. I was like, am I in the wrong class? So I sat in the back. I understood 0 words that were being said. And I remember sitting there and I was like, what am I doing in here? So it's like, why am I in this room? Clearly I don't belong in this room. I remember calling my mom and saying, well, I'm going to have to drop out of school because there's no way I'm passing Spanish ever. And so the ultimate solution was I retook every Spanish class. I went back to Spanish 101, and in my last 4 semesters, I took 4 semesters worth of Spanish to get my degree. I didn't belong in that class. By the end of it, I remember my final exam was an oral exam, and I remember rapping the Donde Está la Biblioteca rap from Community as my final I memorized it. And my professor said, "What are you going to do with Spanish now that you've done 400 levels of Spanish?" And I said, "I don't even know. I will forget all of it." And I did. My other one of those, think of one in your head. My first class ever in seminary, I sat down in New Testament. I sat down. I was so excited. Dr. KKO was teaching. I sat down. They were talking. And he said, "Hey, by next week, I need everyone to turn in an exegetical paper over this chapter and verse." And I said, "I don't know what that word means." Everybody else around me apparently knew what that word meant. I didn't know. It sounded like he said, "Exit Jesus." And I had thought that sounded weird for seminary. But then you go to seminary for... Anyway. But no, I didn't belong. I was very confused. Everybody else apparently had deep theological education in some capacity. And I was sitting there trying to understand what the word exegesis meant. And they were ready to roll. I didn't belong there. It took me a long time to figure out that I belonged in seminary. You ever been somewhere where you go, "I don't belong here. Why am I here?" Hands. Keep that in your brain. I found out I did belong. I passed Spanish, right? I got through it. I belonged in seminary. I made it through it. Could it get worse? Those are famous last words. This is famous last words of intrepid travelers just before the line on the rock climbing gear falls apart and frays in front of you. Just before the parachute, you rip the cord and it erupts with a giant hole in it. It can get worse. Just before the storm for these boys in this boat was about to swallow them up and there's a sight of a figure walking towards this group. What kind of person, animal, or even worse, creature could stroll among these waves and ignore the whipping force of the wind so casually? "A ghost!" one of the men shouted as this figure loomed closer. Long trails of what seemed to be whipping tentacles thrashed above the head of the figure. An apparently large body whipped around as it walked, snapping with the wind behind it. But it continued to move in, closer and closer and closer to the boat. The boys cried out in fear as this terrifying creature inched upon their vessel. Would it stop? Would it just rip the boat apart before the wind and the waves got a chance to? The creature started to speak to them. But they couldn't make out one sound. The roar of the wind and the crashing of the waves mixed with the cries and squeals of terror that the men faced made it nearly inaudible. Was it a growl? Was it a screech of warning before the beast pounced on them? One of them cupped their ear to listen even harder. Courage! Don't be courage. Courage! It's me! Don't be afraid. See how I mix those together? A man's voice. It's not even really shouting at them, but speaking so calmly. It was such a comforting tone, one that they had grown familiar with over the last days and months together. How could this possibly be? It has to be a trick. A man, even one like him, the things we've seen him do, who's done so much unbelievable stuff, couldn't even swim in the torrent of this weather, let alone walk on top of it so calmly. Peter strained his eyes out towards him. The tentacles? His hair, whipping in the wind. The large body, just the cloak soaked with water. How was he so calm? "Hey, Jesus, if it's really you tell me to come out to you on the water, and I'll walk out to you." The expression on the other men's faces. If cameras had existed, the photo of those faces would be in the dictionary next to disbelief and some next to annoyance. Because, of course, Peter would be the one to yell out of this. He's got a nasty habit of speaking before he thinks about it, which often means he eats his shoes more often than he doesn't. Come. So sure. So confident, so casual. Just come. It was like Jesus asking Peter to just go get some water for dinner or sit down in a chair. Come. Peter drew in a deep breath and thought to himself, if Jesus can do it, then I can do it. He told me to follow him, and that means if I die in the depths of the Galilee, buffeted by the wind and the rain, then so be it. I can be like him. If he says to do it, I can do it. He closes his eyes. He moves towards the railing on the edge of the hall. It wasn't too far down to the water at this point. The boat was completely keeled over from the amount of wind and rain that the storm had been pushing. It was a short step down into the water. He raised up his leg and in some sort of leap stepped towards the storming sea. There was so much noise from the storm that it would have been impossible to have heard the sound his feet made when they touched the water and came to a stop. Was it like a slap, like hitting a bucket of Jell-O? Was it more like a thud hitting hard packed soil? Maybe it sounded like sinking feet in a pile of like just barely damp sand on the edge of the beach. But in this moment, Peter's feet stopped on top of the waves and he breathed out a sigh of relief. He wasn't brave enough yet to open up his eyes, but he knew he was standing on the water. And he took another step, and then another one. And he knew by this point he had to be pretty close to where he remembered Jesus was standing when he first leapt out of the boat. He drew in a breath, and he cracked open his eyes, just trying to peek through the wet water droplets on his eyelashes to see if he was close enough to his target. But something happened. Through his eyelashes, he saw his cloak being tossed around and whipping around him, and suddenly he was aware of the force of nature trying its best to throw him back into the depths of the sea. His feet became aware not only of the chill of the cold water that was rushing around his toes, but the motion up and down as the waves moved under and around him. He could see he was next to Jesus, but Peter's mind was no longer in this moment. He was back as the little school kid, laughed out of class for misspelling the word of the week on his slate, getting his memory verses incorrect, miscalling the meaning of text in front of the whole school, his counselor telling him that his best bet was just heading back home and learning how to fish, his old friends who'd moved on to work in the temple, those real world changers, he wasn't like them. What am I doing out here? Why am I here? In a split second, the figure of his rabbi, the one who called him to follow him, to be like him, to help him teach and to heal. His hand was extended towards him, but it was moving farther away. Or was Peter moving farther away? He was sinking. He knew it. He was a failure. He didn't belong there. He cried out as his body sank through the water like a stone, his heavy wet cloaks pulling his body weight, making buoyancy something of an impossibility. Save me. By the time the words left his mouth, he was already pulled up from the water, standing next to Jesus on the water again, just outside the hull of the boat. Peter, why did you doubt? They climbed over the edge and sat in the boat. The others looked terrified as the storm was still in immediate danger to their survival. After all, it was only the two of them that seemed to be able to float on top of water. Compassion. Sensing their fear, their trepidation, Jesus spoke calmly. Calm. And like hitting a mute button on the TV, the noise of the storm ceased instantly. The lake became smooth like glass among the surface of the water, and the late moonlight was still peeking through the now dissipating clouds. It was suddenly the most perfect night on the lake you could imagine. Do you see it? The little hidden message of this story? We so often focus on Peter walking and losing sight and losing faith that he begins to sink. But we miss the subtle, weaving story that's found its way through each of the disciples. Why were they on the boat? Jesus chooses them. He chooses this rabble of people because his movement is a movement for everyone. It's meant for rich, for poor, for women, for men, for educated, and for uneducated. What's one of the things that Jesus actually talks about to his disciples later on and as the story continues? One of the things that he says about them later, about these guys he's chosen to follow him, is they're called this rabble of unschooled fishermen. Jesus' movement's for the peasants and for the scholars. It's a movement of anybody's. It's a movement of the B team, really, the not good enoughs. He calls them to be his disciples. And these 12 school dropouts, zero education, regular old fishermen become world changers in the course of human history. One of the things that we don't often a great answer to, we just gloss over it, is why does Peter, his first response is to jump out of the boat? That's like silly. He's a fisherman. He's a fisherman. You stay in the boat. If you get out of the boat, it's dangerous, right? You don't like actively try to get out of the boat. My story for this. My dad and my grandpa used to race sailboats in Michigan. They used to race sailboats. They would race. They were old. They're old goats. They've done like how many? I don't know. 50 races. I don't even know. 36 races. They won it how many times? Overall 6, 7. Number of children. One of them happened when I was 1 year old, 1991, right? Yeah. Well, to be sailors in this, you have to prove that you're ready in case an emergency happens in the middle of Lake Michigan. So racing from Chicago up to Mackinac Island, you got to prove you know how to handle if you have a problem. So they practice man overboard drills. It's a drill. You practice. If someone falls out of the boat, it's a problem. You stop what you're doing and you get them out of the boat. Because you don't hop out of the boat. It doesn't make any sense. Is it easy to swim fully clothed in Lake Michigan when it's nighttime outside? No, it's not. And it becomes more serious the longer it takes to get them out. I don't know if you've ever treaded water in a pool. Whatever your record is, it's twice as hard when you're wearing clothes. It's very difficult. You stay in the boat. Peter's experienced. You stay in the boat. Why does an experienced fisherman in the middle of a raging storm in Galilee say, I'm going to get out of the boat? Because he is a disciple. He has oriented his entire life. He's devoted everything he does, his whole life, into trying to do what he sees his rabbi doing. He's trying to learn to be like Jesus. Exactly. I talk, she talks. She's trying to learn. So he sees his rabbi walking on water. And the first thing that pops into his mind, the first thing he wants to do is, I want to walk on water too. I want to be like my rabbi. So Peter gets out of the boat and he starts walking on the water. But he starts to sink. And he yells out, "Save me!" And the rest of the text, right, Jesus catches him and he says, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" Now, the way I assume we always read this, and the way that I've heard it taught in Sunday school classes for little kids, is that Peter doubts Jesus, right? Suddenly there's this trepidation. I've lost faith in Jesus. Maybe I can't, he might be able to do it, but I can't picture it anymore, and so I'm sinking. This is how we've heard it, right? He loses the faith that Jesus, I'm scared. Is this how we've heard this before? Yes? Now you're not going to talk, obviously. Who sinks? Peter sinks. Who never sinks? Ooh, there's like an interesting thing there, isn't there? Peter doubts himself. He loses faith in himself. If Jesus couldn't do it, and if doubt was there, Jesus would have sunk with him. Right? Does it make sense? He loses faith in himself. He loses faith that I can't actually be like him. I mean, Jesus wouldn't have called him if he didn't think he could be like him. Jesus reminds his disciples, way down the line, he reminds them, I chose you. And you're not chosen by a rabbi unless they think you can do what they do, that you can be exactly like them. Oftentimes you hear this story and you hear this going back and forth that whether or not you believe in Jesus or you believe in God or do you have the faith to continue to believe in God. But the little hidden character of this story is that Jesus believes in Peter and in us and you and me. Faith in Jesus is super important, but what we don't talk about is Jesus' faith in us. I mean, he had to have had faith in us because he literally, at the end of the story in Matthew, leaves it in the hands of this group of outcasted losers that we call the disciples. The last thing Jesus says to them, Matthew 28:18. Now you go and make disciples. I'm going. It's on you now. He leaves it in the hands of a bunch of anybody's. And they do it, because if they didn't, we wouldn't be here. What if we actually are the kinds of people that God created us to be, that He believes we're capable of being? The kind of people that live like Jesus did, the kind of people who take action because we're aware of endless opportunities all the time, for good, for beauty, for truth. Jesus has faith that you can follow Him and you can be like Him, and He believes it. Peter forgot it. But do you believe it? One of the things that you hear so much about with this story is people say, like, do you have the faith enough to get out of the boat? Have you heard this thing, like, do you have faith enough to get out of the boat? Do you have faith enough? Do you believe in Jesus enough that you're willing to get out of the boat? We've heard this little thing before. The real crux of this story is not getting out of the boat. The question sometimes we have to ask first is, do we have faith enough to believe we belong inside of the boat? Do you think you belong inside of the boat? That's really the first big step, because as soon as you don't believe you belong inside of the boat, you can't become who you were called to be. God believes in you. Do you believe in you? Let's pray.
Pardon the interruption, but I have to check. It seems that some of you might be dead. And it seems that some of you may still be alive, but what I want to see is not a bunch of people who are simply alive, but a bunch of people who are truly living. A bunch of people who have left it all behind, no matter who they were. See, right now you're sitting in that chair and you're thinking to yourself, there have to be like 6 billion people on this planet. 6 billion other people God could use and would use. And you see, there are, but you are one of them. You can't just be the one person sitting on the side. You have to be the one who stands up and says yes. You have to get past the things in your life where you say, I'm not good enough to be used by God. You can no longer say, surely not me. You see, Moses had a speech impediment. Jonah ran from God. Samson was a womanizer. Jacob was a liar. And Joseph's own brothers sold him into slavery. And Jesus, far from the pedigree of any king. There was Rahab, the prostitute. Hosea was married to an unfaithful woman. Gideon couldn't trust God. And Timothy, looking the resurrected Jesus in the eyes, had to touch the holes to know he was alive. Jeremiah was depressed all the time. David got a married woman pregnant and sent her husband to the front lines to die just so he could hide his own shame. Abraham had no patience for God's timeline. Matthew was a cheating tax collector. Paul murdered and persecuted Christians, and Peter was so rash and reacted to everything without thinking anything through. John the Baptist was so poor he couldn't afford dirt. Sarah was barren. Esther was just a little girl. Timothy was too young. Mary was too lazy. Martha worked too much, and Lazarus was just plain dead. So how could God not use you? What could possibly be so wrong with you that you could not be used by the Creator of the universe? It's time that we bring light into the darkness. But to do this, we're going to have to follow in the footsteps of others who came before us.